1, 2, 3, 4.
Howdy. Howdy. I had 300 Russians say howdy, so I thought I'd try to get 300 Argentinians to say howdy as well. My name's Wynn Netherland. I'm Penguin most places on GitHub, Twitter. I work at GitHub since May. You may have heard me on the Changelog podcast. We cover what's fresh and new in open source. You found us on iTunes. We're also up on GitHub at GitHub/Explorer. I have a thing for dot files. Who has their dot files up on GitHub? That's it? You know, that was kind of the reaction I had when I started cargo culting Ryan Tomeko and Zach Holman and their dot files set up to trick out Vim and tmux and all the other command line utilities that I use. So Adam Yankee, a friend of mine, and I created .files.github.com. Anybody seen this? A few hands. If you don't have your dot files up on GitHub, check out this website. It's a resource to kind of point you towards some frameworks that if you're just doing it by hand, if you want something a little bit more structured to back up your dot files and sync those to your home folder, you can check that out. There's a lot of frameworks that are available out there. So dot files is a big turn on for me because I'm a text mode guy. This is a turn off for me. When a website can't find a feed, if I find a really great website and it's got great content, I want to subscribe in my RSS reader, and it says it can't find a feed. So despite what you may have heard, RSS is not dead. There's literally dozens of us that actually use this on a day-to-day basis. It's kind of my funnel for the changelog and some other things. So I get disappointed when I hit a website and get an alert box, number one, but alert box that says there's no feed on the page. So sometimes I get care mad enough to fork somebody else's open source blog and add a feed. I've done this recently. It's that important. Something else I like to do is write API wrappers. So on Sunday afternoon, since I have very little hobbies, I'll sit around and kick the tires of new APIs. I'm just always trying to discover what's new out there in API land. So I've written a number of API wrappers for some APIs that are now defunct, like Gowalla and others. It was a nice website. I wish that was still around. I could have gotten a new continent. Checking in on Gowalla down here. Had the opportunity to contribute to the Twitter gem, John Nunemaker's Twitter gem, and that turned into writing an API wrapper for the GitHub API a couple of years ago called OctoKit. And so I'm pretty sure this is what got me the job at GitHub. I had no idea GitHub uses this gem internally on a lot of projects. Had I known that, I probably would have put more effort into it earlier. It started out as a hobby project, but is used quite extensively at GitHub. One of the cool things about working at GitHub is you get to pretty much pick what you want to work on. So wherever your passions intersect your skills and intersect a need, that little sweet spot of that three-way Venn diagram allows you to pretty much work on what you want to work on. Unfortunately, you can't pick your titles at GitHub. So this is the team page, as it were. Quite literal interpretation of my username. So for a while, first few months at GitHub, I was flightless waterfowl, which if you tell Hubot a disparaging remark in Campfire, like, Hubot, you suck, this is what comes back, which is pretty funny. Last week, Tim Berglund changed my title to de facto API evangelist. Essentially, he wrote up an idea in our team app that said, hey, we need an API evangelist to kind of evangelize our API. Several people wrote back. I thought Wynn already did that. So that's the de facto piece of that. So evidently, it's kind of an official title, more or less now. So I'm on the API not team with Technoweenie, a.k.a. Rick Olson, Paul, and Peter. There's 4 of us now hacking on API. Timothy Clem as well, doing a lot of API work. And so today I want to talk about UX patterns for APIs. If you saw another title name up there, I totally had a different talk that I was going to do today. But one thing that I learned at GitHub is it's not done until it's done. And so I just didn't feel great about where that talk was. So instead of shipping it, I am going to do a version 2.0 of a talk I did last month called UX Patterns for API. So we'll go through some of the good ways and bad ways that you can design an API and either delight or really turn off some of the folks that are consuming your APIs. So pattern number 1 is supporting curling. Not sure what you guys call that, but back in the States we call this curling. So for me, when I pick up a new API, it's really important to be able to poke on it and kick the tires and play with it easily without having to go through a whole lot of hoops. And supporting curling allows you to do that. So in this case, we're curling the GitHub API, getting the information back for Chris Weinstrath, aka Defunct. I have a thing for color, so I'm using an app called GRC that I can pipe curl through, and it's got some regular expressions that adds color to the headers and to the body output. So check my dot files if you're interested in that, but I really like syntax highlighting. But this is a case here where I can curl one input on the API, endpoint on the API, and get some data back really painlessly. I don't have to go through a whole lot of authentication hoops. So one of the ways that you can do that is support basic auth. Basic auth has some downsides, but as far as getting up and running fast for developers, basic auth is very important. So in this curl example, the I switch returns the headers along with the body. You can use a capital I to return just the headers if that's what you're interested in. I can authenticate via basic auth with the U switch, pass in Penguin, my username. It will prompt me for my password. You'll see a lot of examples that put the username and password and a colon pair. Don't do that because that'll get stuck in your shell history and someone will have your GitHub password or a more important password out there. An anti-pattern, security mazes. How many times have you wanted to play with a new API and getting on board looks something like this? This is an actual door latch, which is kind of a novelty. It's a labyrinth, a little game there to latch the door. I'm not sure how that would work in case of a fire, but this is an actual product. It reminds me of this. This is OAuth's, Yahoo's OAuth flow for OAuth 1.0. Who's used an OAuth 1.0 library? Anybody like it? Yeah. With signed requests and things of that sort, multiple sets of keys, it becomes a nightmare trying to make an OAuth 1.0 call. There's whole libraries that do nothing but abstract that piece out of other wrapper libraries. So the takeaway there is OAuth is painful. OAuth 2 hurts less. So OAuth became popular, implemented by Twitter API. OAuth 2 has kind of a Facebook heritage. It's far less painful because you don't have to sign the requests. So at GitHub, we've implemented OAuth 2, and we have an authorizations API that I'm surprised a lot of folks haven't heard about, so I kind of highlight this in the talks that I give, because it used to be down on the page and you had to scroll down to see it. But we have an API called authorizations that you can use basic auth to get an OAuth token back. So instead of having to go through the Webflow song and dance to come back, redirecting twice and doing a post to get an OAuth token, you can simply make one curl call and get an OAuth token and play with that right in your terminal. Another anti-pattern, insane URLs. I love that photo. This is a URL from the shopping.com API. There's nothing wrong with this URL, but it's just one of those things that just as so many times we're building applications, we think user experience is only in the user interface, but user experience is also in the terminal. So think about the overhead that you're providing for your developer by having to type all of this. It's a four-level domain name here. Have this publisher namespace, a version, REST, which I'm not sure should be implied, right? And then this general search, this big camel-cased set of parameters. This is just not that user-friendly. Nothing wrong with it, but it could be a lot more terse. This is another one from Google Maps. This actually is pretty awesome, what they cram into one request to get a static image back from the Google Maps API. What I'm nitpicking with here is the use of pipe delimiters that show up as the %7s. And if you're like me, when you see URI encoded parameters, your eyes start to just go a little hazy, and it's kind of hard to grok that when you first see it. So pick delimiters if you can that don't have to be URI encoded. Another pattern is to maximize the payload. So there's always this tension in applications of the N+1 problem of do you provide a lot of data up front, or do you make the consumer make multiple calls? We face this in active record all of the time, but with APIs it's worse because it's an N+1 over HTTP problem. So one of the things that you can do is if you've already have an open connection, pass what you can back if it's cheap in the context to do so, so they're not having to make multiple trips. This is an example of Twitter's API. This is a Twitter API list at penguin/GitHubbers that we list everybody that's, or I do, keep track of everybody that's on Twitter that's a GitHubber. They return the entire user object directly in this list. It would be really easy to return a screen name and an ID, but they return the whole user object, so you don't have to make a second call to go to Gravatar or something like that. Anybody know who this is? Thank you. Nobody in Russia knew. I was so disappointed. So this is the worst pun that I've got in the entire deck. One of the things you can do is rock the cache. So curling the same endpoint that we did earlier to get defunct's information back. The first time that you call it, we return 200. But notice we return some extra information in the headers. We return this cache policy that says how long the information is good for. Return an E tag, which is essentially a fingerprint of the request that you can then use that in subsequent requests to get to check to see if that resource has been updated. So you do this with conditional requests. Here's using the E tag. You've got the if none match, and you pass the E tag back that you got the first time. And you'll notice it returns a 304, not modified. Your browser does this extremely well. So a lot of times that's why you have to hit shift refresh to get fresh information because your browser's automatically caching. HTTP wrappers, you have to put some little extra work into to hanging on to that information. There's rat cache. There's a Faraday cache project that works with the Faraday projects that I work with that will handle 304s for you. And then here's an example of using it with the if modified since. So instead of if not modified, you have if modified since timestamp that you can pass into a conditional request that's based on a date range, which is cool. Another pattern is to dog food your application. And so this is a popular term made famous by Microsoft of eating your own dog food. So it means consume your API and build something meaningful with it. So get outside of the implementation side of the firewall, get on the other side and start consuming it and put yourself into your user's shoes. We do this at GitHub. We have a build server called Janky. Anybody seen Janky? It's like Qbot meets Jenkins. It's what runs our deploys at GitHub, which is really cool. Our builds, I should say. Heaven runs our deploys. We have a monitors app. So if you go to the office at GitHub, there's monitors everywhere that show metrics on new signups and how much file servers are growing to and all of these different metrics, really metrics driven. But you can run the same apps on your iPad or your iPhone. Just authenticate with your company credentials, and I can have new signups there on an iPad running on a second screen on my desk, which is pretty cool. We have the team app I mentioned that's kind of like our internal Twitter. Sometimes it's an internal Facebook type of thing, where we kind of bubble up ideas and debate them before they turn into pull requests. We have Hire, which is our homegrown HR funnel to identify candidates and positions and talk about them, and it's all works off of the GitHub API for authentication and pulling back social profile data. Something called the setup. Anybody heard of the setup? It's kind of a, Steve has. It's been kind of a secret, a really good secret that we've got that the word is starting to get out. Will Farrington and John Barnett have been working hard on the setup, which essentially is opinionated Puppet setup that someone can come in with a brand new laptop, run GH setup, curl a script, and 0 to 15 minutes, depending on bandwidth, you've got your laptop ready to go to hack on github.com, which is really, really cool, because that's not something I'm good at. I'm learning. The Graph Store, anything that you want in Graphite, you can go to the Graph Store and put in a custom query, and it will even give you a hubot command to paste that into Campfire to share that with other people. So if there's something that you want to track and get a pretty graph for. I think the biggest abuse of this is probably Vanity Me. I don't know if anybody's seen this. So on Campfire, you can All these scripts are open source out on Hubot's profile, but /vanity_me, and it will give you the list of all the Twitter handles in the company and what their follower rates are. But you can say vanity graph and 2 Twitter handles, and it will do the intersection of the graph to show who's getting more Twitter followers. It's total vanity. So I want to talk a little bit about how we use the GitHub API at GitHub. Instead of just the apps, we use OAuth for authentication. Sometimes you'll hear that called auth-in. We also use it for authorization. OAuth kind of serves both purposes in that. So authorization, so authentication is who you are. Authorization is what you can do in the system. We use it for merging. So our Heaven deploys. When you deploy a branch or deploy code at GitHub, this blew my mind when I first started. You take a branch and you deploy it straight to production. And Hubot, when you tell him to deploy in Campfire, he will go and make sure that your code has had master merged down into it. And if not, Hubot will go and do a commit, and he'll merge master into your branch. If everything's green, he throws it out in production, and you watch it and make sure the build's okay for a period of time, and then you go back to the pull request and merge that down. So that merge API that we just added probably 2 months ago was for that very purpose, because got to be kind of a traffic jam when you would go to deploy, and Hubot would just come back and say, master's not been merged down into your branch, and you have to go do that manual step. Now that's automatic. Commit status, anybody using the commit status API that just launched a few weeks ago? Anybody using Travis CI? A couple of hands, wow. Big secret down here. Check out Travis CI, it's awesome, especially if you're open source projects. So they use the commit status API. We have our own internal box that does that, and that will use that commit status API and go and put that little green dot next to a commit to let you know that a particular commit is actually green, which is cool. That's really cool on pull requests. So now when people post patches to your project, you can tell if they're green without having to pull it down and run your own tests against that. GitHub flavored Markdown, so the Markdown that you put in to like the issues comment box and things of that sort has a repository context so that it automatically links up issues and things. We have an API that exposes that, and that's exposed in some of our apps. The big consumers of our APIs at GitHub are native apps. So we have GitHub for Mac. Any GitHub for Mac users? A few hands. What about GitHub for Windows? You guys know that it exists, right? Any Windows users in here? A couple of hands. You don't have to be ashamed. Ruby runs on Windows. Another pattern is HTTP status codes, using them appropriately. So how many times have you seen something like this, an API that returns a status code 200 for everything? And then you have to parse some custom JSON output to know if it was an error or not. HTTP does a great job of handling errors itself, so that error not found in the previous example would be better served returned as a 404. And the reason for doing that is if you leverage HTTP, your tooling can leverage HTTP. So you can handle standard status codes and react accordingly. We all know what a 404 means. Another anti-pattern is confusing the header with the body. This is just freaky. A lot of times, people will cram everything into the body of the payload that's coming back from a JSON, from a REST call, usually just in a big JSON hash. But if it's not describing the actual resource, if it's metadata, you're better served putting that into header fields. We do this at GitHub with our OAuth scopes. So if you make a call to GitHub authenticating via OAuth with a particular token, we return custom headers back to say what the method expected as far as OAuth scopes, meaning the method expects a repo scope because you're hitting a private repo. But you returned public repo, or you provided public repo. So it's a good way to check, hey, the key, the token that I'm using, does it fulfill the needs of this method that I'm calling? So those are good examples. Another thing that we do at GitHub is for pagination. We've moved that up to the header in the link header. So there's link rel next, link rel previous links up there that handle pagination, and it's not polluting the body of the resource. This is another one, harsh rate limits. We just recently lowered our unauthenticated rate limits last week down from 5,000 by default to 60, and that seems sort of harsh. We had to do that just to maintain quality of service for everyone. We had some folks that were abusing the API, and unfortunately, if you don't authenticate, we don't know who you are to go tap you on the shoulder and say, please stop that. So we had to lower the boom, as it were, to prevent that. So now you only get 60 if you're not authenticated, but we make authentication pretty easy, so we don't think that's a big deal. This is what that looks like. So make the same curl call to get a user back, and we return, this is what I'm talking about returning meta information in the header. So the rate limit is how many calls you get an hour, and the remaining is how many you have left. If you need to do it in an unauthenticated fashion, so when you authenticate like that, the API is thinking that whoever's token that is the current user. If you need to make an unauthenticated call, you can just pass your, this is an access token version, you can pass your client secret and client ID across, and we will authenticate the app for the rate limit, but not authenticate the user for the response, if that makes sense. And we're pretty generous on bumping OAuth applications. So if you build a cool mashup, and don't be shy about asking for more rate limit if you need it. Another pattern is announcing breaking changes. So when you have danger ahead, be sure and tell people. We did this with the authentication piece. We also recently did this with changes that we had to change around the star and watching APIs. So we announced that on the changes blog, so you can go to developer.github.com/changes and see that. One more pattern is making documentation obvious. I could watch this all day. I really could. So you really want to make documentation slap you upside the face, so to speak. Stripe does a good job of this. I love, and evidently the projectors cut it off, but Stripe has multiple language support, so you can click Ruby or Perl or Python at the top. Maybe not Perl, but Python and JavaScript definitely to get examples in that language. Parse is another good example of great documentation that follows all of their resources. To pile onto that, create awesome guides. This is an IKEA guide to building a DeLorean-based time machine, if you ever need to do that, which I thought was really cool. So Twitter does a good job at providing guides around their entities, working with their timelines, and these are pretty much scenario-driven instead of method-driven. So if I want to do subscription billing, what 3 method calls do I need to make with Stripe, things of that sort. Parse has a iOS framework guide. Another good pattern are consoles. So API consoles to poke at an API if you don't want to use curl. This is the Graph Explorer by Facebook. It's a great one. Apogee's got like an uber amount of consoles that you just punch in which API you want to work with, and it comes back with pretty much every method in the API. It's really cool. Another anti-pattern is endless terms of service changes, where you feel like you're on this just treadmill of changes. I think Twitter's been guilty of this recently with just constantly pulling the rug out from under developers, especially those that make competing products. That's something you want to avoid if you can. Another anti-pattern is inconsistency. I've got a thing for penguins, but I'll pick on GitHub briefly. We try to choose nouns when we can when we're constructing our resources, but we've got one that kind of bugs me. There's a fork method. It's a verb on gist, but there's no merge method. It's post to merge is. So it's inconsistency like this that kind of bugs me. Hopefully we'll get that fixed one day. One that I really like, a pattern, is fast, transparent support. So I like to be as quick as possible when I'm providing support to people. I'll reply with even I don't know and get back to you while I investigate the issue. But being transparent does it goes a long way to creating super fans of your product. So we make it easy to get in touch with us and tell us you're having a problem with the GitHub API. Free samples, another good pattern. Braintree does this by passing out working code in several different scenarios. There's Rails and Sinatra apps there to use their Ruby frameworks. Mashup friendly. Build something in a browser using either JSON-P for getting around cross-site scripting issues. It's kind of ghetto, but it works. This is what it looks like. It wraps, if you add a callback, it will wrap the return in a function call, and will stash what usually goes in the header into a meta object. There's CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, which is a little bit more 21st century way of doing that. If you got questions, hit me up later. I've got a few slides to get through here. Streaming is another pattern. We haven't implemented this yet at GitHub, but we're always keen on looking at new patterns. Streaming is basically a persistent HTTP connection where you can get updates over the wire as they happen. And speaking of streaming, there's a GitHub drink up tonight. Hope to see you guys there. If you have any questions about APIs, then give me a holler. Thanks.
Preguntas, levanta mano, questions. ¿Alguien? Bueno, yo tengo una. Do you plan to support PDI for your API?
We haven't looked at it yet. There's a number of protocol changes that we're kicking around. There's always a trade-off between making it harder on ops and making it easier on developers. So.
¿Más preguntas? Questions?
Sorry, this is driving me crazy, but how come that glass is not getting full?
This is called a cinemagram. So there's a great app out there. I'm not sure it was created with this app, but it's a way to create an animated GIF where you take a video and then you paint just the parts that you want to animate it, and it turns it into an animated GIF. So everything is frozen except for that animation, and then it's just on a loop. Everything's magic at GitHub. We just, this is how it works.
¿Más preguntas? ¿Alguien? ¿Preguntas?
Hey, Wynn. So doing REST, right, it's kind of hard. I've been implementing APIs, and it's like you kind of go this endless rabbit hole forever. So I pretty much guide myself through some of Steve Klapnick's stuff. I know he's somewhere over there.
Top
so,
row.
Do you have any resources, any Bibles that you follow through when you're designing APIs?
Designing hypermedia APIs. What's the URL?
Yeah. No, it's pretty much the same I'm using.
Yeah.
There's a JSON type called HAL that helps you with hypermedia stuff, and I've seen Technowini ask questions in public about it, but I don't work at GitHub, so cool. I don't know if they're going to use it or not.
So we're taking HAL throughout the rest of the API. If you look at our pull requests, but HAL is just one approach to doing hypermedia-driven APIs and how you take those links and express them in the output. HAL is one of the ones that we're looking at. It's popular, but there's others out there, and I don't want to steal any of Steve's thunder. Tomorrow I'm sure he'll mention some of these. But as far as doing REST right, that's probably going to be an endless debate based on some of the news groups I'm on. So,
thank you.
Una última pregunta. One last question. Bueno, muchas gracias, Wynn.
Thanks.